The piercing scream echoed through the marble corridors of the Whitmore estate, causing every crystal chandelier to tremble in its wake. Victoria Whitmore, only 9 years old, stood at the top of the grand staircase, her face flushed crimson with rage, her tiny fists clenched so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Below her, the latest governess fled toward the front door, tears streaming down her cheeks, her resignation letter already crumpled in her trembling hand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Get out! Get out! I hate you! Victoria's voice cracked with the force of her fury, each word launched like a weapon designed to wound. The governess didn't dare look back as she stumbled through the ornate foyer, past the oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to judge her failure from their gilded frames. The massive oak doors slammed shut behind her with a finality that reverberated through the entire mansion. Richard Whitmore emerged from his study, his perfectly pressed suit wrinkled from another sleepless night, his salt and pepper hair disheveled in a way that would have horrified his business associates. At 45, he commanded boardrooms across 3 continents, wielded billions with the flick of his pen, and could make or break companies with a single phone call. Yet he stood powerless at the bottom of his own staircase, watching his daughter transform into a creature he barely recognized. "That's the 7th one this month," he whispered to himself, running his hands through his hair as Victoria's sobs echoed from above. The sound cut through him like shattered glass, each cry a reminder of his complete inadequacy as a father. How had it come to this? How had the sweet little girl who once braided flowers in her mother's garden become this tempest of rage and pain? The Whitmore mansion stood like a fortress against the Connecticut skyline, its pristine white columns and manicured grounds a testament to 3 generations of accumulated wealth. Every window gleamed, every hedge was perfectly trimmed, every surface polished to mirror brightness. Yet beneath this facade of perfection lay a darkness that money couldn't illuminate, a wound that no amount of luxury could heal. Victoria had not always been this way. There was a time, not so long ago, when her laughter had filled these same halls, when her small feet had raced across these marble floors in pursuit of butterflies that had somehow found their way indoors. She had been the light of her parents' lives, a precocious child with her mother's emerald eyes and her father's sharp intelligence, tempered by a gentleness that seemed to make everyone around her want to be better. Elena Whitmore had been the kind of mother who got down on her hands and knees to examine anthills with her daughter, who turned rainy afternoons into indoor camping adventures, who sang lullabies in 3 languages and made every bedtime story an epic journey. She had possessed an ethereal beauty that seemed to glow from within, but it was her warmth, her infinite capacity for love, that had truly made her extraordinary. The staff had adored her, the community had respected her, and Richard had worshipped the very ground she walked upon. But Elena was gone now, claimed by a rare illness that had ravaged her body with merciless efficiency despite the best medical care money could buy. The doctors had used words like aggressive and unprecedented, but all Richard heard was the sound of his world crumbling. Elena had fought with grace and dignity right until the end, holding Victoria's small hand and whispering promises she would never be able to keep. The change in Victoria had been gradual at first. She had retreated into herself, spending hours in her mother's garden, talking to the roses as if they could somehow carry her messages to heaven. Richard had thought it was a normal part of grief, something that time would heal. He had been wrong about so many things. The first incident had occurred 6 months after the funeral. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly housekeeper who had worked for the family for over 2 decades, had attempted to brush Victoria's hair before breakfast. The child had exploded with such violence that Mrs. Patterson had dropped the silver brush, watching in shock as it clattered across the bathroom tiles. Victoria had screamed accusations, called her names that no 9-year-old should know, and locked herself in her bedroom for 3 days. Richard had dismissed it as an isolated incident, a moment of overwhelming grief that had simply boiled over. He hired child psychologists, the best money could buy, but Victoria refused to speak to them. She sat in their offices like a beautiful statue, her green eyes cold and distant, answering their gentle questions with silence or occasionally, terrifyingly, with screams that sent them scurrying from the room. As the months passed, the pattern became undeniable. Victoria's rage seemed to focus exclusively on women. Any woman. It didn't matter if they were staff members she had known since birth or complete strangers. The moment a woman entered her sphere, something inside her would snap. She would transform from a quiet, withdrawn child into a hurricane of fury, screaming until her voice was hoarse, throwing whatever objects were within reach, and hurling insults with surgical precision. The parade of dismissed employees had become legendary in their social circles. Governesses lasted days, sometimes hours. Tutors fled after single lessons. Even the most patient, experienced childcare professionals found themselves overwhelmed by Victoria's relentless hostility. Some whispered that the child was possessed, others suggested boarding schools or residential treatment facilities. Richard rejected every suggestion, clinging to the belief that love and patience would eventually break through to his daughter. But with each passing day, Victoria seemed to drift further away from him. She would eat her meals in silence, her small face a mask of controlled fury. She answered his questions with monosyllables when she answered at all. The only time she showed any emotion was when a woman entered her presence, and then she became a creature of pure, focused hatred. The house itself seemed to absorb this darkness. The laughter that had once echoed through its halls was replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by Victoria's periodic outbursts. The staff moved through their duties with the quiet efficiency of people walking on eggshells, never knowing when the next explosion might occur. Even the gardens, Elena's beloved sanctuary, had begun to wither despite the best efforts of the groundskeeping team. Richard found himself working longer hours, partly from necessity but mostly from a desperate need to escape the suffocating atmosphere of his own home. Board meetings and business deals provided a refuge where he could still function, where his competence wasn't questioned, where he could pretend that his personal life wasn't disintegrating. But every evening, he would return to that marble mausoleum and face the reality of his failure as a father. The breaking point had come on a Tuesday morning in late autumn. Victoria's latest governess, a stern woman from Switzerland with credentials that read like academic poetry, had lasted exactly 47 minutes. The woman had made the mistake of trying to enforce a schedule, suggesting that Victoria needed structure and routine to help her process her grief. Victoria's response had been so violent, so filled with venom, that the governess had actually called the police, convinced that the child posed a genuine threat. Richard had arrived home from an emergency meeting to find squad cars in his driveway and his daughter barricaded in her room, screaming obscenities that would have made hardened criminals blush. The officers, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, had awkwardly suggested that perhaps professional help was needed. Richard had nodded and agreed and made all the appropriate noises, but inside he was dying a little more with each word. That night, after the police had gone and the governess had collected her things and disappeared into the darkness, Richard had sat in his study with a bottle of Elena's favorite wine, staring at a photograph of his family taken just 2 years earlier. They had been at the beach house in the Hamptons, all three of them laughing at something Victoria had said, their faces glowing with happiness and security. Elena's arms were wrapped around both of them, her expression radiant with contentment. They had looked invincible, protected by love and fortune from the troubles that plagued ordinary families. How naive they had been. How utterly, completely naive. The wine tasted bitter on his tongue as he considered his options. The psychologists were unanimous in their recommendations for residential treatment. Victoria needed intensive therapy, they said, in an environment where her behavior could be properly managed and her underlying trauma addressed. But the thought of sending her away, of admitting defeat so completely, felt like another kind of death. Elena would never have forgiven him for giving up on their daughter, for choosing the easy path over the difficult work of healing a broken child. But what if he was being selfish? What if his refusal to consider residential treatment was actually hurting Victoria more than helping her? The questions tormented him through the long, sleepless night, each possibility more agonizing than the last. By dawn, he had consumed the entire bottle and reached no conclusions except that he was the worst kind of failure, the kind that hurt the people he loved most in the name of protecting them. The next morning brought a hangover that felt appropriate for his emotional state and a phone call that changed everything. Margaret Chen, the director of the most exclusive domestic staffing agency in the city, was calling with what she described as a unique opportunity. She had received a request for placement that was, in her words, highly irregular but potentially perfect for the Whitmore family's specific needs. "I have a woman," Margaret said carefully, "who has specifically requested to work in challenging situations. She's not looking for an easy placement, Mr. Whitmore. In fact, she seems to prefer the difficult ones." There was a pause, and Richard could hear the rustle of papers in the background. "Her name is Sarah Martinez, and her references are unusual." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She's worked with several families dealing with traumatic situations, and she has a reputation for staying when others give up. Richard felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. "What kind of background does she have?" "That's where it gets interesting," Margaret continued. "She doesn't have traditional childcare credentials. Her background is in social work and crisis intervention. She's worked in women's shelters, with survivors of domestic violence, with children who have experienced severe trauma. She's not a governess in the classical sense, but she might be exactly what Victoria needs." The interview had been scheduled for the following afternoon, and Richard had found himself pacing his study like a caged animal as the appointed time approached. He had interviewed dozens of potential caregivers for Victoria, and each meeting had followed the same pattern. Impressive credentials, confident assurances, promises of breakthrough techniques that would surely reach his troubled daughter. And then, inevitably, the tearful phone calls and hastily written resignation letters. Sarah Martinez arrived precisely on time, and Richard's first thought was that she looked utterly ordinary. She was a woman in her early 30s, average height, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and clothes that suggested practicality over fashion. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance, nothing that suggested she possessed any special powers or unique insights that might succeed where so many others had failed. But there was something in her eyes, a quality that Richard couldn't quite name. They were dark brown, almost black, and they seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. When she shook his hand, her grip was firm but not aggressive, confident but not presumptuous. She settled into the leather chair across from his desk with the ease of someone comfortable in her own skin, waiting for him to begin the conversation rather than rushing to fill the silence with nervous chatter. "I assume Margaret has told you about our situation," Richard began, studying her face for any sign of judgment or discomfort. He had grown accustomed to watching potential employees' expressions change as they learned the details of Victoria's behavior, had seen the exact moment when professional interest transformed into polite but firm refusal. Sarah nodded once. "She mentioned that your daughter has been struggling since her mother's passing, and that she's had difficulty accepting female caregivers." Her voice was calm, matter-of-fact, devoid of the false sympathy that had characterized so many previous conversations. She also mentioned that Victoria's reactions can be quite intense. "Intense," Richard repeated, tasting the inadequacy of the word. "That's certainly one way to put it. The last governess compared her to a feral animal. The one before that suggested we consider exorcism." He waited for Sarah's expression to change, for the inevitable moment of realization that this job was beyond her capabilities. Instead, Sarah leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes focusing on him with an intensity that was somehow both comforting and unsettling. "Tell me about Elena," she said quietly. "Tell me about Victoria's mother." The request caught Richard off guard. In all the interviews, all the consultations with experts, no one had ever asked him to talk about Elena. They wanted to know about Victoria's triggers, her behavioral patterns, her medical history, but they showed little interest in the woman whose loss had shattered his daughter's world. Elena was. Richard stopped, surprised by the emotion that rose in his throat. She was everything good in this world. She had this way of making everyone around her feel special, important. She never met a stranger, never passed someone in need without offering help. Victoria worshipped her. Sarah nodded, as if this information was somehow significant. What was their relationship like? Were they close? Inseparable, Richard said, the word coming out rougher than he intended. Elena homeschooled Victoria for the first few years, not because she had to but because she wanted to be part of every moment of her daughter's education. They had their own rituals, their own jokes, their own secret language. Sometimes I felt like an outsider looking in on this perfect bond between them. And when Elena became ill, the question hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications. Richard closed his eyes, remembering those final months when their beautiful life had slowly disintegrated into a nightmare of hospitals and treatments and false hopes. Victoria never left her side, he said finally. Even when the doctors said it might be traumatic for a child to witness. Elena insisted. She said Victoria needed to understand, needed to be part of the process. I thought she was wrong, but I deferred to her judgment. I always deferred to Elena's judgment when it came to Victoria. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was gentler. What did Elena tell Victoria about dying? Richard felt his chest tighten with the memory. She said that love never dies, that even when people leave their bodies, the love they shared continues. She told Victoria that every time she felt scared or alone, she could close her eyes and feel her mother's love surrounding her like a warm blanket. She said that mothers never really leave their daughters, that they live on in their hearts and memories and in the way they treat other people. And how has Victoria responded to other women since then? With rage, Richard said simply. Pure, unfiltered rage. It's like she sees every woman as a threat, as someone trying to replace Elena or diminish her memory. The angrier she gets, the more she talks about her mother, about how no one could ever be as good as Elena, how no one has the right to try. Sarah was nodding, as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place in her mind. Mr. Whitmore, I'd like to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. In all of Victoria's outbursts, in all of her screaming and accusations, has she ever mentioned anything specific that Elena said to her? Any particular words or phrases that seemed to trigger the strongest reactions? Richard frowned, searching his memory for patterns he might have missed. She always says the same thing when she's really upset. She screams that no one understands, that her mother told her something important, something that makes it impossible for other women to take care of her. But she never says what it was. When I try to ask her about it later, she just shuts down completely. I see. Sarah sat back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Mr. Whitmore, I'm going to be honest with you. I think Victoria is protecting something, holding on to a secret that she believes is her connection to her mother. Until we understand what that secret is, until we can help her process whatever Elena told her in those final days, she's going to continue pushing away every woman who tries to care for her. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that Victoria's behavior isn't random or purely emotional. There's something specific driving it, something she believes she's honoring by rejecting other women. My job won't be to break through her defenses or force her to accept my presence. My job will be to earn her trust slowly, carefully, until she feels safe enough to share whatever burden she's carrying. And you think you can do that? Richard asked, hardly daring to hope. Sarah Martinez looked him directly in the eyes, her expression serious but not unkind. I think Victoria has been waiting for someone who won't give up on her, someone who understands that her anger is really grief in disguise. I think she's been testing every woman who walks through that door, waiting for someone strong enough to see past the screaming to the broken little girl underneath. But what if you're wrong? What if she's simply too damaged, too lost in her grief to be reached? Sarah stood up, smoothing down her simple skirt with hands that were steady and sure. Then at least she'll know that someone tried, that someone cared enough to stay and weather the storm with her. Sometimes, Mr. Whitmore, that's the most important gift we can give a grieving child. The knowledge that they're worth fighting for, even when they can't fight for themselves. As Richard watched her gather her things and prepare to leave, he felt something shift inside his chest. It wasn't quite hope, not yet, but it was the absence of despair, which was more than he had felt in months. Sarah Martinez might not have impressive credentials or revolutionary techniques, but she had something that all the others had lacked. She saw Victoria not as a problem to be solved but as a child to be understood. "When can you start?" he asked, the words leaving his mouth before he had consciously decided to offer her the position. Sarah smiled for the first time since entering his office, and the expression transformed her entire face. "I can start Monday morning, if that works for you. But Mr. Whitmore, I need you to understand something. This isn't going to be quick, and it's not going to be easy. Victoria's going to test me in ways that will probably shock both of us. I need your commitment that you won't give up on this process when things get difficult." "You have it," Richard said without hesitation. "Whatever it takes." As Sarah Martinez walked out of his study and through the marble corridors of his mansion, Richard found himself wondering if he had just made the best decision of his life or the worst one. Either way, for the first time in months, he felt like he was actually doing something rather than simply enduring the slow destruction of his family. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the windows of the great house, and somewhere in the upper floors, Victoria Whitmore sat in her bedroom, unaware that her world was about to change once again. In 3 days, a woman unlike any of the others would walk through her door, and this time, the screaming might not be enough to make her leave. The stage was set for a confrontation that would either heal a broken family or shatter it beyond repair. And in the gathering darkness of the Connecticut evening, the Whitmore mansion held its breath, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made promises feel possible. Sarah Martinez stood at the gates of the Whitmore estate, her single suitcase at her feet and a leather messenger bag slung across her shoulder. She had deliberately chosen to arrive early, wanting to observe the house and its rhythms before the formal introductions began. The mansion loomed before her like something from a Gothic novel, all pristine white stone and soaring columns that spoke of old money and older secrets. The security guard at the gate, a weathered man with kind eyes, had already been briefed about her arrival. He buzzed her through with a sympathetic smile that told Sarah everything she needed to know about the household's reputation among the staff. As she walked up the curved driveway, her footsteps echoing against the perfect silence, she noticed how even the birds seemed to avoid this place, as if the very air carried a warning. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly housekeeper Richard had mentioned, met her at the front door. The woman's face bore the exhausted expression of someone who had witnessed too many arrivals and departures, who had learned not to invest hope in new faces that would inevitably disappear. She was polite but distant as she led Sarah through the grand foyer, past oil paintings that seemed to watch their progress with disapproving eyes. "Mr. Whitmore is in his study," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He wanted to speak with you before you meet Victoria." The pause before his daughter's name spoke volumes about the household's collective anxiety. "She's having breakfast in the morning room. Alone, as usual." Sarah nodded, filing away these details like puzzle pieces. A house where the staff spoke in whispers, where a 9-year-old ate her meals in isolation, where the very mention of the child's name caused grown adults to hesitate. The architecture of trauma was often more visible in what wasn't said than in what was. Richard emerged from his study looking as though he hadn't slept, which Sarah suspected was probably true. His expensive suit was impeccable, his hair perfectly styled, but his eyes held the hollow look of a man running on caffeine and desperation. He shook her hand with the careful politeness of someone trying very hard to maintain normal social conventions in a decidedly abnormal situation. "I hope you slept well," he said, though they both knew that sleep had probably been elusive for everyone in the house. "She's been asking about you." "Not directly, of course, but she's been more agitated than usual since I mentioned that someone new would be starting today." Sarah studied his face, reading the layers of worry and guilt that had become his constant companions. "What exactly did you tell her about me?" "I said that you were someone who specialized in helping children who had lost their mothers, that you understood grief in a way that others might not." Richard ran his hand through his hair, disturbing its careful arrangement. She didn't respond, but I could see something shift in her expression. I'm not sure if it was anger or curiosity or fear. With Victoria, it's often difficult to tell the difference. "That's understandable," Sarah said gently. When children are carrying heavy emotional burdens, their responses can be complex and contradictory. She might be curious about meeting someone who claims to understand her pain, but also terrified that I'll disappoint her like everyone else has. They were interrupted by a sound that made both adults freeze. It started as a low rumble, almost like distant thunder, but quickly escalated into something far more menacing. The crash of breaking china followed, accompanied by a voice that could have shattered crystal. "I don't care. I don't want her here. Send her away like all the others." Victoria's voice carried through the mansion with the force of a hurricane, every word precisely articulated despite the obvious emotion behind them. Sarah could hear the sound of furniture being moved, objects hitting walls, and underneath it all, the unmistakable sound of a child's grief masquerading as rage. Richard's face went pale. "I'm so sorry. She must have seen you arrive. She watches from her bedroom window sometimes, studies everyone who comes to the door." He took a step toward the stairs, his instinct clearly to intervene, but Sarah caught his arm. "Wait," she said quietly. "Let me listen for a moment." The tantrum continued, but Sarah's trained ear was picking up patterns that others might miss. Victoria's voice was strong and clear, her words carefully chosen for maximum impact. This wasn't the incoherent screaming of a child having an emotional breakdown. This was a performance, designed to achieve a specific result. The girl was orchestrating her own rejection, creating a scenario so unpleasant that any reasonable adult would choose to leave rather than endure it. "She's not out of control," Sarah observed, her voice thoughtful. "She's very much in control. This is strategic, Richard. She's trying to drive me away before I have a chance to get close enough to hurt her." More crashes echoed from above, followed by Victoria's voice again, this time with a different quality. "Mama told me. Mama told me the truth. No one else can know." Richard's intake of breath was sharp enough to cut glass. "She's never said that before. Never mentioned her mother telling her anything specific during one of these episodes." Sarah was already moving toward the stairs, her expression focused and determined. "I need to see her now, while she's in this state. Sometimes children reveal the most when they think they have the least to lose." "Are you sure?" Richard asked, his voice tight with worry. "She's thrown things before. Heavy things." "I'll be careful," Sarah assured him, though her attention was already fixed on the source of the commotion. "But I need to understand what's driving this behavior, and right now, she's showing me exactly what that is." The second floor of the mansion was a study in controlled elegance, all pale carpet and cream-colored walls adorned with tasteful artwork. But the serenity was shattered by the chaos emanating from behind a set of double doors at the end of the hall. Sarah could see that several other doors along the corridor were slightly ajar, revealing staff members who had obviously been drawn by the noise but were too frightened to intervene. Sarah approached Victoria's room with the measured pace of someone who understood that sudden movements could escalate an already volatile situation. The doors were locked, but the key was in the hallway lock, suggesting that Richard maintained the ability to access his daughter's room even when she barricaded herself inside. She knocked gently, a sound barely audible above the ongoing destruction. "Victoria? My name is Sarah. I'd like to talk with you." The noise stopped abruptly, as if someone had thrown a switch. The sudden silence was almost more unnerving than the chaos had been. Sarah could picture the little girl on the other side of the door, probably frozen in place, trying to decide whether to acknowledge this new voice or resume her campaign of destruction. "I know you don't want me here," Sarah continued, her voice calm and conversational. "I know you've decided that I'm just another person who's going to try to replace your mother, and you're absolutely right to be angry about that. No one could ever replace Elena." There was a soft thud from inside the room, as if something had been set down rather than thrown. Sarah took this as encouragement to continue. "Your father told me about her, about how special she was. He said you two had your own secret language, your own jokes that no one else understood. That sounds wonderful. I bet she made you feel like the most important person in the world." The silence stretched longer, and Sarah began to wonder if Victoria had retreated entirely, shutting down the way Richard had described. But then, so quietly she almost missed it, came a voice that sounded nothing like the furious child who had been destroying her room moments before. "She did, Victoria whispered, and the raw grief in those two words was like a physical blow. She made everything better. Everything. Sarah slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor outside the door, making herself as non-threatening as possible. Tell me about her. Tell me what made her so special. The silence stretched so long that Sarah wondered if she had pushed too hard, asked for too much too soon. But then Victoria's voice came again, still quiet but stronger than before. She never lied to me. Everyone else lies to children, tells them things will be okay when they won't be, says things that aren't true to make them feel better. But Mama never did that. She told me the truth about everything, even when it was scary. That sounds like she really respected you, Sarah said carefully. She trusted you to handle difficult truths. She did. There was a note of pride in Victoria's voice now, mixed with the grief. She said I was mature for my age, that I could understand things that other children couldn't. She said that was a gift, but also a responsibility. Sarah felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift in her mind. Elena had treated Victoria like a confidant, sharing adult concepts and emotions with a child who had been eager to prove herself worthy of such trust. It was a pattern she had seen before in her work with trauma survivors, the way some parents, facing their own mortality, inadvertently burdened their children with information and emotions that were too heavy for young minds to process. What kind of responsibility did she talk about? Sarah asked gently. The question was met with another long silence, and Sarah could almost feel Victoria wrestling with something on the other side of the door. When the girl spoke again, her voice was thick with tears. I can't tell you. I promised. I promised her I would never tell anyone, especially not other women. She said they wouldn't understand, that they would try to change things or make decisions that weren't theirs to make. Sarah's heart began to race. This was it, the key to understanding Victoria's behavior. Elena had shared something with her daughter, something that the dying woman had felt was crucial for Victoria to know but dangerous for others to discover. And in her grief and confusion, the child had interpreted this secret as a reason to reject anyone who might try to take her mother's place. Promises to people we love are sacred, Sarah agreed. Your mother trusted you with something important, and you've been protecting that trust all this time. That shows incredible strength and loyalty. It does? Victoria's voice was small and uncertain, as if she hadn't considered that her behavior might be seen as protective rather than destructive. Absolutely. But Victoria, can I ask you something? When your mother made you promise to keep her secret, do you think she meant that you should be alone forever? That you should never let anyone else care for you? The question hit its mark. Sarah could hear movement on the other side of the door, the sound of small feet pacing back and forth. When Victoria spoke again, there was confusion in her voice. I don't know. She said I was special, that other women wouldn't understand me the way she did. She said they would try to make me ordinary, try to make me forget the important things she taught me. But you haven't forgotten, Sarah pointed out. You've remembered everything she told you, protected it fiercely. Maybe too fiercely. Maybe so fiercely that you've been protecting yourself right into loneliness. The pacing stopped. Sarah held her breath, waiting to see if her words had resonated or if they had triggered another explosion of rage. But when Victoria spoke again, her voice was thoughtful rather than angry. Are you different from the others? The question was loaded with so much hope and fear that Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a physical presence. How did you promise a grieving child that you wouldn't abandon her without making promises you might not be able to keep? How did you offer hope without feeding into the pattern of disappointment that had defined her recent experiences? I'm different in some ways, Sarah said honestly. I've worked with children who have lost parents before. I understand that grief isn't something you get over, it's something you learn to carry. And I know that sometimes the people we love most give us gifts that feel more like burdens, especially when we're young. Gifts that feel like burdens, Victoria repeated slowly, as if testing the concept. Is that what you think Mama gave me? I think your mama loved you so much that she wanted to prepare you for a world without her in it. But sometimes, when adults are facing death, they share things with children that are meant to be helpful but end up being overwhelming instead. It doesn't mean she didn't love you perfectly. It just means she was human, and humans sometimes make mistakes even when they're trying to do the right thing. The door handle turned slowly, and Sarah found herself holding her breath. After a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the door opened just a crack, revealing a single green eye that was so much like Elena's that Sarah felt a chill of recognition. "You think my mama made a mistake?" Victoria asked, her voice barely audible. Sarah chose her words carefully, knowing that this moment could determine the entire trajectory of their relationship. "I think your mama did the best she could with an impossible situation. I think she loved you so much that she wanted to give you everything she could before she had to leave. But sometimes, when we're trying to give someone we love the whole world, we accidentally give them more than they can carry." Victoria opened the door a little wider, and Sarah got her first clear look at the child who had become the center of so much concern and confusion. She was small for 9, with Elena's delicate bone structure and Richard's intelligent eyes. Her dark hair was tangled from sleep and emotion, her face streaked with tears, but there was something indefinably regal about her posture, as if she had been raised to believe herself capable of bearing any burden. "What if the thing she told me is too important to share?" Victoria asked. "What if sharing it would ruin everything?" "Then we don't share it," Sarah said simply. "We figure out how to honor your promise to your mother while also making sure you don't have to carry that weight all by yourself. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is ask for help, even when we've promised to be strong." Victoria stared at her for a long moment, her green eyes searching Sarah's face for any sign of deception or false comfort. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she stepped back and opened the door fully, revealing a room that looked like a tornado had swept through it. Books lay scattered across the floor, their pages bent and torn. A lamp had been overturned, its shade dented and askew. Pillows from the bed were strewn about like fallen soldiers, and the contents of several drawers had been emptied onto the carpet. But in the center of it all, Victoria stood like the eye of the hurricane, calm now that the storm had passed. "I'm sorry about the mess," she said, her voice taking on the careful politeness that children use when they're trying to be grown up. "I get angry sometimes." "I can see that," Sarah said, stepping carefully into the room. "It must be exhausting, carrying all that anger around." Victoria nodded, suddenly looking much younger than her 9 years. "It is. But I don't know how to stop. Every time someone new comes, I think about what Mama told me, and I get scared, and then I get angry, and then I start screaming." Sarah began picking up some of the scattered books, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid startling the child. "What if we tried something different? What if, instead of getting angry when you think about your mother's words, you told me about the feeling behind them? Not the words themselves, just how they make you feel." Victoria watched her for a moment, then began gathering pillows from the floor. "They make me feel special and scared at the same time. Special because Mama trusted me with something important, scared because I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep the promise forever." "That's a very honest answer," Sarah said, replacing a book on the shelf. "And it helps me understand why you've been pushing people away. You're not really angry at the governesses and tutors. You're overwhelmed by the weight of keeping your mother's secret, and anger is easier to handle than fear." "Is that bad?" Victoria asked, her voice small. "It's not bad, it's human. But it's also lonely, and I don't think that's what your mother wanted for you. Do you?" Victoria shook her head slowly, tears beginning to form in her eyes again. "She wanted me to be happy. She always said that my happiness was the most important thing in the world to her." "Then maybe," Sarah suggested gently, "we can find a way to honor her memory and her trust while also making room for you to be happy. Maybe we can find a way for you to keep your promise without having to be alone." The child considered this, her young face serious with concentration. "You really think there's a way? I think your mother was a very wise woman who loved you very much. And I think that if she could see you now, sitting in a destroyed room, pushing away everyone who tries to care for you, she would want us to find a better way. A way that honors what she taught you while also letting you be a child." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out across her features. The need to protect her mother's memory warred with her desperate desire for connection, for someone who would understand the burden she had been carrying alone for so many months. Finally, she looked up at Sarah with eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. "If I told you how Mama's words make me feel, would you promise not to try to change my mind about keeping them secret?" "I promise," Sarah said without hesitation. "Your promise to your mother is yours to keep. I'm here to help you figure out how to keep it without sacrificing your own happiness." Victoria took a deep breath, as if preparing to dive into deep water. "She told me something about women, about how they think and what they want. She said that most women wouldn't understand me because I'm different, because I see things that others don't. She said that if I wasn't careful, they would try to make me ordinary, try to convince me that the things she taught me weren't important." Sarah nodded, beginning to understand the shape of Elena's final gift to her daughter. A dying mother, desperate to prepare her child for a world without her guidance, had tried to arm Victoria with what she perceived as essential wisdom. But in doing so, she had inadvertently created a barrier between her daughter and half the human race. "And so when women come to care for you," Sarah said carefully, "you feel like you need to protect yourself from their influence. You feel like accepting their help would be betraying your mother's trust." "Exactly." Victoria's relief at being understood was palpable. "They don't mean to be bad, but they don't know what Mama knew. They can't see what she could see. And if I let them get close to me, I might start to forget the important things, or I might accidentally tell them something I shouldn't." Sarah sat down on the floor, making herself Victoria's height, equalizing the power dynamic between them. "Victoria, can I tell you something about secrets?" The girl nodded, her attention completely focused on Sarah's words. "Secrets are like seeds," Sarah began. "Some secrets are like flower seeds. They need to be planted in the right soil, at the right time, and they grow into something beautiful that makes the world better. But some secrets are like weed seeds. They take root in dark places and grow wild, choking out all the good things around them." Victoria frowned, clearly thinking hard about this analogy. "What kind of seed do you think Mama's secret is?" "I think it started as a flower seed," Sarah said honestly. "I think your mother gave you something that was meant to help you grow strong and wise. But I also think that secret has been sitting in dark soil for too long, without enough light or air to grow properly. And now it's starting to act more like a weed, keeping you isolated from the very connections that could help you flourish." The child was quiet for a long time, and Sarah could see her processing this new way of thinking about her mother's final words. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than defensive. "So you think there might be a way to keep Mama's secret but not let it keep me alone? I think there might be a way to honor what your mother was trying to teach you while also recognizing that she was human, and humans sometimes give advice that needs to be adjusted as we grow and change." Sarah reached out slowly, offering her hand to Victoria. "Would you be willing to work with me to figure that out?" Victoria stared at Sarah's outstretched hand for a long moment, and Sarah could see the war between hope and fear playing out in her young features. This was the moment of truth, the point where Victoria would either take the first step toward healing or retreat back into the protective shell of rage that had defined her existence for the past year. Slowly, so slowly that Sarah wasn't sure it was actually happening, Victoria reached out and placed her small hand in Sarah's larger one. Her fingers were trembling, and her grip was tentative, but she was making contact. She was choosing trust over isolation, hope over fear. "I'll try," Victoria whispered, and those two words carried the weight of 1,000 promises. "But if you hurt me, if you try to make me forget Mama or break my promise to her, I'll never forgive you." "That's fair," Sarah said, gently squeezing the small hand in hers. "And if I ever do anything that makes you feel like I don't respect your mother's memory or the trust she placed in you, I want you to tell me immediately. We're going to be partners in this, Victoria. We're going to figure it out together." For the first time since Sarah had entered the house, Victoria smiled. It was a small, tentative expression, barely more than a softening around her eyes, but it was genuine. And in that moment, Sarah knew that they had taken the first crucial step on what would undoubtedly be a long and difficult journey. The room was still destroyed, the household still walking on eggshells, and Victoria was still carrying a secret that was slowly poisoning her relationships with the world. But something fundamental had shifted. The wall of rage and rejection that had protected the child's heart for so many months had developed its first crack, and through that crack, the possibility of healing had finally begun to shine through. Downstairs, Richard paced his study, listening to the unusual silence from the second floor and wondering if he dared to hope that this time might be different. For the first time in months, no doors had slammed, no one had come running down the stairs in tears, and no resignation letters were being hastily composed. Perhaps, just perhaps, Sarah Martinez was exactly what his daughter needed. Someone who could see past the anger to the frightened child beneath, someone who understood that sometimes love could become a burden and that healing required not just patience but wisdom. As the morning sun climbed higher in the Connecticut sky, the Whitmore mansion held its breath, waiting to see if the fragile connection forming between woman and child would be strong enough to withstand the storms ahead. Because Victoria's secret was still intact, still casting its shadow over her ability to trust and connect. And until that burden was properly addressed, until Elena's final words were examined in the light rather than hidden in darkness, the real work of healing could not begin. But for the first time in a very long time, there was reason for hope. And sometimes, in the darkest moments of a family's crisis, hope was all that stood between destruction and the possibility of something better. The following weeks unfolded with a delicate rhythm that surprised everyone in the Whitmore household. Sarah had established a routine with Victoria that seemed to respect the child's need for control while gently expanding her comfort zone. They spent mornings in the garden that had once been Elena's domain, afternoons in the library reading together, and evenings working on puzzles that required patience and cooperation. The screaming fits had diminished to occasional outbursts, usually triggered by unexpected changes or the mention of topics too close to Victoria's guarded secret. Richard watched these developments from a careful distance, afraid that his presence might somehow disturb the fragile peace that had settled over his home. For the first time in over a year, he could walk through his own halls without bracing for the sound of breaking glass or his daughter's anguished cries. The staff moved with less tension, and even Mrs. Patterson had begun humming softly as she went about her duties, a habit she hadn't indulged since Elena's death. But Sarah knew that this calm was deceptive, built on avoidance rather than resolution. Victoria was still carrying Elena's secret like a stone in her chest, and until that burden was addressed, their progress remained fundamentally unstable. The child had learned to trust Sarah enough to accept her presence, but she hadn't yet learned to trust her enough to examine the words that had shaped her isolation. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday afternoon when Victoria was particularly restless. She had been picking fights over small things, testing boundaries that had been established weeks earlier, and Sarah recognized the signs of a child wrestling with something too big to carry alone. They were in the morning room, supposedly working on Victoria's correspondence lessons, but the girl's attention kept drifting to the windows where raindrops traced erratic patterns down the glass. "I hate rain," Victoria said suddenly, pushing her workbook away with unnecessary force. "It makes everything gray and sad." Sarah looked up from her own writing, noting the tension in the child's shoulders and the way her hands had clenched into fists. "Rain can feel melancholy," she agreed. "Does it remind you of something specific?" Victoria's jaw tightened, a sure sign that Sarah had touched on something significant. "It was raining the day Mama told me the important thing. The day she made me promise." Her voice had taken on the careful, controlled tone she used when discussing anything related to her mother's final words. "That must have been a difficult day," Sarah said gently, setting down her pen and giving Victoria her full attention. "Sometimes weather becomes connected to memories in ways that make it hard to separate the two." "She was so weak," Victoria continued, her eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window. "But her voice was still strong when she told me. She said it was the most important thing she would ever tell me, more important than all the fairy tales and lessons she had taught me before." Sarah felt her heart rate quicken but kept her expression neutral. Victoria had never come this close to discussing the actual content of Elena's secret. It sounds like she really wanted you to understand how significant her words were. Victoria nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. She said that after she was gone, people would try to tell me things about women, about how I should think and act and what I should believe about myself. She said that most of what they told me would be lies designed to make me weak and ordinary. The pieces of Elena's final message were beginning to take shape in Sarah's mind, and what she saw troubled her deeply. A dying woman, desperate to prepare her daughter for independence in a world that could be harsh to women, had tried to pass on wisdom that had instead become a prison. What did she say about women specifically? Sarah asked carefully. Victoria's hands twisted in her lap, and Sarah could see the child's internal struggle between her promise to keep the secret and her desperate need to share the burden. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She said that women are taught to compete with each other instead of supporting each other. She said that most women would see me as a threat because I'm smart and different, and they would try to tear me down or make me doubt myself. She said that the only way to protect myself was to never let them get close enough to hurt me. Sarah felt her heart break for both mother and daughter. Elena, facing her own mortality, had tried to arm Victoria against a world she perceived as hostile to intelligent, independent women. But in doing so, she had created a self-fulfilling prophecy that isolated her daughter from the very connections that could help her thrive. She also said, Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger as the words poured out, that if I ever trusted a woman other than her, that woman would eventually betray me. She would pretend to care about me, but really she would be trying to control me or use me or make me into someone I'm not. She said the only way to honor her memory was to never let that happen. The full weight of Victoria's burden now lay exposed between them, and Sarah understood why the child had fought so desperately against every woman who had tried to care for her. Elena's final words hadn't just been advice, they had been a prophecy that Victoria felt compelled to fulfill, a test of loyalty to her mother's memory that required her to reject connection in order to prove her love. Victoria, Sarah said carefully, do you think your mother was right about all women? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Victoria's eyes flashed with the old anger. Of course she was right. Mama was never wrong about important things. She saw people clearly, saw their real intentions even when they were trying to hide them. But what about me? Sarah asked gently. Have I tried to tear you down or make you doubt yourself? Have I tried to control you or change who you are? Victoria's certainty wavered, confusion replacing anger in her expression. You're different. But Mama said that the dangerous ones would seem different at first. She said they would be patient and kind until they got close enough to do real damage. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. So according to your mother's words, I'm either genuinely different, which would make her wrong about all women being the same, or I'm just better at hiding my true nature than the others were. The logic of this statement hit Victoria like a physical blow. For the first time since her mother's death, she was being asked to examine Elena's words critically rather than simply accept them as absolute truth. The conflict between her loyalty to her mother and her growing trust in Sarah created a tension that was almost visible in her small frame. I don't know, Victoria whispered, and those 3 words represented a seismic shift in her worldview. I don't know what to think anymore. Sarah leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact with the child. Victoria, do you think it's possible that your mother, who loved you more than anything in the world, might have been wrong about some things? Not because she didn't love you, but because she was human, and humans sometimes make mistakes even when they're trying to protect the people they care about most. Victoria's face crumpled, and the tears she had been holding back finally spilled over. But if she was wrong about that, what else might she have been wrong about? And if I stop believing her words, does that mean I'm betraying her memory? Oh, sweetheart, Sarah said, moving closer to the crying child. Questioning someone's words doesn't mean you're betraying their love. It means you're growing up, developing your own ability to think and judge and make decisions. I think your mother would be proud to see you learning to think for yourself, even if it means examining some of the things she told you. Victoria looked up at Sarah through her tears, her young face streaked with confusion and grief. But what if she was right? What if trusting you is a mistake? What if you do hurt me eventually? Sarah considered this question seriously before answering. That's always a possibility, Victoria. Every relationship carries the risk of disappointment or pain. But the alternative is living alone forever, and that's a different kind of pain, isn't it? The pain of isolation and loneliness. Yes, Victoria whispered. It is. So maybe, Sarah suggested gently, the question isn't whether it's safe to trust people. Maybe the question is whether the risk of being hurt is worth the possibility of being loved and supported and understood. Victoria was quiet for a long time, processing this new way of thinking about her mother's final words. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than defensive. Mama was scared when she told me those things. I could see it in her eyes. She was scared of leaving me alone in the world, scared that people would hurt me after she was gone. I'm sure she was, Sarah agreed. And when people are scared, especially when they're dying, they sometimes give advice that comes more from fear than from wisdom. It doesn't mean they don't love us. It just means they're human. Victoria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that made her look very young and vulnerable. So what do I do now? How do I know which of Mama's words to keep and which ones to let go of? It was a profound question from such a young person, and Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. How did you help a child learn to honor her mother's memory while also developing the critical thinking skills necessary for healthy relationships? I think, Sarah said slowly, that we can honor your mother by keeping the parts of her advice that help you grow strong and independent, while recognizing that some of her fears might not serve you well in the long run. We can remember that she was trying to protect you, even if some of her methods might need adjustment. Like what part should I keep? Victoria asked, genuinely curious. Sarah smiled. The part about being smart and different being strengths rather than weaknesses. The part about not letting people make you doubt yourself or change who you are at your core. The part about being independent and thinking for yourself. Those are all valuable lessons. And what part should I let go of? Maybe the part about never trusting women. Maybe the idea that everyone who wants to care for you has ulterior motives. Maybe the belief that you have to be alone to be safe. Sarah paused, letting these words sink in. What do you think? Victoria considered this carefully, her young mind wrestling with concepts that would challenge many adults. It's scary, she admitted. If I let go of some of Mama's words, I feel like I'm letting go of her. But you're not, Sarah assured her. Your mother's love isn't contained in specific words or rules. Her love is in your heart, in your memories, in the way she taught you to be curious and brave and kind. Those things don't disappear when you start thinking for yourself. As if summoned by their emotional conversation, Richard appeared in the doorway of the morning room. He had obviously been drawn by the sound of Victoria's tears, but he paused when he saw the two of them sitting close together, engaged in serious conversation rather than locked in conflict. Is everything all right? He asked uncertainly, clearly unsure whether his presence would be welcome or disruptive. Victoria looked up at her father, and for the first time in over a year, she didn't automatically retreat or become defensive at his approach. Sarah and I were talking about Mama, she said simply. About the things she told me before she died. Richard's expression grew cautious. He had learned to be wary of conversations about Elena, knowing they could trigger explosive reactions from his daughter. What about them? I think, Victoria said slowly, as if testing each word, that maybe Mama was wrong about some things. Not because she didn't love me, but because she was scared and sick and maybe not thinking clearly about everything. The silence that followed this statement was profound. Richard stared at his daughter as if she were speaking a foreign language, unable to believe what he was hearing. For over a year, Elena's final words had been treated like sacred text, unquestionable and absolute. To hear Victoria herself suggest that some of those words might be flawed was nothing short of revolutionary. What specifically do you think she might have been wrong about? Richard asked carefully, moving slowly into the room and taking a seat across from them. Victoria glanced at Sarah for support before answering. She told me that women couldn't be trusted, that they would all try to hurt me or change me eventually. But Sarah hasn't done any of those things, and it's been weeks now. So maybe Mama was wrong about that part. Richard felt tears prick at his eyes. This was more emotional growth from Victoria than he had seen since Elena's death, more evidence of mature thinking than many adults ever displayed. That sounds like very wise reasoning, sweetheart. But it's also scary, Victoria continued, her honesty brutal in its simplicity. Because if Mama was wrong about that, I have to figure out how to trust people on my own. I have to decide for myself who is safe and who isn't. That's what growing up is, Sarah said gently. Learning to make those judgments for yourself instead of relying on rules that other people gave you, even people who loved you very much. Victoria turned to her father, her green eyes serious and sad. Daddy, I'm sorry I've been so mean to everyone. I was trying to protect Mama's secret, but I think I was really just protecting myself from having to think about whether she might have been wrong. Richard moved to kneel beside his daughter's chair, taking her small hands in his larger ones. You have nothing to apologize for, Victoria. You were doing the best you could with a very difficult situation. I'm proud of you for being brave enough to question things that seemed certain. Are you angry that I might not believe everything Mama told me? Victoria asked, vulnerability clear in her voice. Oh, sweetheart, no, Richard said firmly. I think your mother would be proud to see you learning to think independently. She always said that the greatest gift we could give you was the ability to make good decisions for yourself. Victoria considered this, then looked back at Sarah. So what happens now? How do I learn to trust people without being stupid about it? Sarah smiled at the practical nature of the question. We take it slowly. We pay attention to how people treat you over time, not just how they act when they first meet you. We look for consistency between what people say and what they do. And we remember that making mistakes is part of learning, that getting hurt sometimes doesn't mean we should stop trying to connect with people. Will you help me learn that? Victoria asked, and the trust in her voice was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Of course I will, Sarah promised. We'll figure it out together. Over the following days, the atmosphere in the Whitmore mansion continued to evolve. Victoria began joining her father for breakfast, something she hadn't done since Elena's death. She started speaking to Mrs. Patterson and the other staff members with courtesy rather than hostility. Most remarkably, she began asking questions about her mother that went beyond the sacred final words, wanting to remember Elena as a complete person rather than just as the source of absolute truth. One evening, as Sarah was helping Victoria prepare for bed, the child made a request that surprised them both. I want to write a letter to Mama, Victoria said suddenly. Not a real letter, obviously, but like a pretend one. I want to tell her about the things I've been thinking, about how I'm trying to honor her memory while also growing up. Sarah felt her heart swell with pride and affection for this remarkable child who was learning to navigate such complex emotional territory with such grace. I think that's a beautiful idea. Would you like help with it, or would you prefer to write it on your own? Could you help me? I want to make sure I say it right. They sat together at Victoria's small writing desk, and Sarah watched as the child carefully composed her thoughts. The letter that emerged was both heartbreaking and hopeful, a testament to Victoria's growth and her continuing love for her mother. Dear Mama, Victoria wrote in her careful script, I miss you every day, but I'm learning that missing you doesn't have to mean being alone forever. I think you were trying to protect me when you told me not to trust other women, but I'm starting to think that maybe you were more scared than wise when you said that. Sarah has shown me that some women can be trusted, that they can care about me without trying to change me or hurt me. I hope you're not disappointed in me for questioning your words. I still love you more than anything, and I'll always remember the good things you taught me. But I'm also going to learn to make my own decisions about people, because I think that's what growing up means. I hope you understand. Love always, Victoria. As Sarah read the letter aloud, both she and Victoria were crying, but they were tears of healing rather than despair. The child had found a way to honor her mother's memory while also claiming her own right to grow and change and form her own relationships. I'm proud of you, Sarah said, gathering Victoria into a gentle hug. This letter shows incredible courage and wisdom. Do you think Mama would be proud too? Victoria asked, her voice muffled against Sarah's shoulder. "I think your mother would be amazed to see how strong and thoughtful and brave you've become," Sarah assured her. "I think she would be especially proud to see you learning to think for yourself while still carrying her love in your heart." That night, Victoria slept more peacefully than she had since Elena's death, and for the first time in over a year, the Whitmore mansion felt like a home rather than a mausoleum. The child's secret had been examined in the light rather than hidden in darkness, and while the process had been painful, it had also been liberating. Richard, listening to the unusual quiet from his daughter's room, allowed himself to hope that they had turned a corner, that the worst of their family's crisis was finally behind them. Sarah had not only reached his daughter but had helped her develop the emotional tools necessary for healthy relationships moving forward. But even as peace settled over the household, Sarah knew that their work was far from finished. Victoria had made tremendous progress in examining her mother's final words, but she still had to learn to apply these new insights to the world beyond the mansion's walls. She had to learn to trust her own judgment about people while remaining appropriately cautious. She had to learn that questioning her mother's words didn't diminish her love or loyalty. Most importantly, Victoria had to learn that she could honor Elena's memory not by rigidly following rules created in fear and desperation, but by living the kind of full, connected, authentic life that Elena would have wanted for her daughter. It would take time, patience, and continued support, but for the first time since Elena's death, such a life seemed genuinely possible. The rain had stopped, and through Victoria's bedroom window, the first stars were beginning to appear in the clearing sky. It felt like a metaphor for the family's journey from darkness toward hope, from isolation toward connection, from fear toward the possibility of love. And in her small bed, surrounded by the peace that comes from finally sharing a burden too heavy to carry alone, Victoria Whitmore slept the sleep of a child who had learned that growing up didn't require abandoning love, only learning to carry it more wisely. 3 months had passed since Victoria's emotional breakthrough, and the transformation in the Whitmore household was nothing short of miraculous. The mansion that had once echoed with screams and slammed doors now resonated with laughter and conversation. Victoria had begun attending a local private school, where she was slowly learning to navigate friendships with children her own age. The transition hadn't been without challenges, but with Sarah's guidance and her father's unwavering support, she was discovering that the world outside her home could be a place of wonder rather than threat. The real test of Victoria's growth came on a crisp December morning when Richard announced that his sister Margaret would be visiting for the holidays. Margaret Whitmore was everything that Elena's fearful warnings had painted women to be: ambitious, outspoken, and unafraid to challenge the status quo. She was a successful corporate lawyer who had built her career on being tougher and more ruthless than her male counterparts. In the past, her visits had been sources of tension even when Elena was alive, as the two women had fundamentally different philosophies about femininity and strength. When Richard broke the news to Victoria over breakfast, Sarah watched carefully for signs of the old panic. The child's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and her eyes grew thoughtful, but there was none of the explosive rage that would have characterized her reaction months earlier. "Aunt Margaret is very different from Mama," Victoria said carefully, as if testing her own response to this observation. "She's loud and she argues about things and she wears suits like a man. Does that worry you?" Sarah asked gently, recognizing this as a crucial moment in Victoria's ongoing development. Victoria considered the question seriously. "A little," she admitted. "The old me would have been afraid that she would try to change me or tell me that Mama was wrong about things. But now I think maybe I can listen to what she says and decide for myself whether it makes sense." Richard nearly choked on his coffee. The idea that Victoria might actually engage with Margaret rather than hiding from her was beyond his wildest hopes. Margaret had always been a challenging presence in their family dynamic, not because she was malicious, but because she represented everything that Elena had taught Victoria to distrust about successful women. "What if she says things that contradict what your mother told you?" Sarah asked, continuing to probe Victoria's emotional readiness for this encounter. "Then I'll think about whether Mama might have been wrong about that too," Victoria said with a matter-of-fact tone that belied the enormous emotional growth such a statement represented. "I'm learning that people can be wrong and still love me. Even Mama." When Margaret arrived 3 days later, she swept into the Whitmore mansion like a force of nature. She was tall and elegant, with sharp-featured beauty that spoke of intelligence and determination. Her silver hair was cut in a severe bob that somehow managed to be both professional and feminine, and her tailored black suit spoke of success and confidence. She embraced Richard warmly before turning her penetrating gaze on Sarah and Victoria. "So you're the miracle worker I've been hearing about," she said to Sarah, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to command. "Richard tells me you've managed to reach our Victoria where others have failed." Sarah felt Victoria tense beside her, but the child didn't flee or explode into rage. Instead, she stepped slightly forward, meeting her aunt's direct gaze with remarkable composure. "Sarah isn't a miracle worker," Victoria said quietly. "She's just someone who listened to me without trying to fix me right away." Margaret's eyebrows rose with surprise and approval. "Well said, young lady. Too many adults think they know what's best for children without bothering to ask the children themselves." She knelt down to Victoria's level, a gesture that immediately shifted the power dynamic. "I've missed you, sweetheart. I know we haven't always understood each other in the past, but I'd like to try again if you're willing." Victoria studied her aunt's face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to look for genuine intention beneath surface behavior. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. "I'm willing to try," she said. "But I might ask you questions about things, and you have to promise to answer them honestly even if the answers are complicated." Margaret laughed, a rich sound that filled the foyer with warmth. "Complicated answers are my specialty, Victoria. I'm a lawyer, remember? We never give simple answers to anything." Over the following days, Margaret proved to be exactly the kind of influence that Elena's fears had warned against, and exactly the kind of influence that Victoria needed to continue her growth. She challenged assumptions, asked probing questions, and refused to accept easy answers to complex problems. But she did so with evident love and respect for Victoria's intelligence, treating the 9-year-old as a worthy conversational partner rather than as a child to be protected from difficult truths. The pivotal conversation happened on Margaret's third evening at the mansion. She and Victoria were in the library, a room that had become Victoria's favorite space for serious discussions. Margaret was reviewing some legal documents while Victoria worked on a school project about influential women in history. "Aunt Margaret," Victoria said suddenly, looking up from her research. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Fire away," Margaret replied, setting aside her papers to give Victoria her full attention. "Do you think women are naturally competitive with each other? Do you think we're programmed to see other women as threats?" The question was so mature, so precisely articulated, that Margaret felt a moment of surprise. This was not the kind of inquiry she expected from a 9-year-old, but she had promised honest answers to complex questions. "That's a fascinating question, Victoria. What makes you ask it?" Victoria's hands twisted in her lap, a gesture that Sarah had learned indicated deep thought rather than anxiety. "Mama told me before she died that women couldn't be trusted because they would always see me as competition. She said that because I was smart and different, other women would try to tear me down or make me ordinary. But you're smart and successful, and you don't seem to want to tear me down. So I'm wondering if Mama was wrong about that." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and Victoria could see her aunt processing not just the question but the pain behind it. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentler than Victoria had ever heard it. "Your mother wasn't entirely wrong, sweetheart, but she wasn't entirely right either. It's true that some women have been taught to compete with each other instead of supporting each other. Society often pits us against each other for jobs, for men's attention, for resources that seem scarce. But that's learned behavior, not natural instinct. And it's behavior that many of us are working to change. So it's not inevitable?" Victoria asked hopefully. "Not at all. Some of my closest friends and strongest allies are women. We collaborate, we support each other's successes, we lift each other up when we're struggling. Your mother may have had experiences that made her distrustful of women, or she may have been trying to prepare you for a world that can indeed be competitive and sometimes cruel. But that doesn't mean you have to live in that world. Victoria absorbed this information with the serious attention she gave to all new concepts that challenged her existing beliefs. How do you tell the difference? How do you know which women can be trusted and which ones can't? Margaret smiled. The same way you judge anyone's trustworthiness, regardless of gender. You watch how they treat people who can't benefit them. You notice whether their actions match their words over time. You pay attention to whether they celebrate your successes or try to diminish them. Gender isn't really the determining factor, Victoria. Character is. Mama always said I was special because I could see things that others couldn't see. She said that made me different from other girls, and that difference would make them jealous or threatened. You are special, Margaret agreed. But not because you're different from other girls. You're special because you're intelligent, thoughtful, and brave enough to question difficult things. And you know what? There are lots of other girls who are special in their own ways. Supporting them doesn't diminish your own specialness. In fact, recognizing and celebrating other people's gifts usually makes our own shine brighter. Victoria's eyes widened with this revelation. For over a year, she had carried the burden of believing that her intelligence and sensitivity made her fundamentally incompatible with other females. To hear her successful, accomplished aunt suggest that these qualities could actually be sources of connection rather than division was revolutionary. Do you really believe that? Victoria asked. I do. And I'll tell you something else, sweetheart. Your mother's love for you was real and deep and wonderful. But love doesn't make people infallible. Parents, even the best ones, sometimes give their children advice that comes more from their own fears and wounds than from wisdom. It doesn't mean they didn't love us. It just means they were human. That evening, Victoria found Sarah reading in the morning room and climbed into the chair beside her. The physical closeness was something that would have been impossible months earlier, but now it felt natural and comforting. I had a good talk with Aunt Margaret, Victoria announced. She helped me understand some things about Mama's words. What kind of things? Sarah asked, closing her book to give Victoria her full attention. That maybe Mama was trying to protect me from her own bad experiences with women, but that doesn't mean I have to have the same experiences. Margaret says that some women are competitive and mean, but some are supportive and kind, and the trick is learning to tell the difference. Sarah felt a warm glow of pride and affection for this remarkable child who continued to amaze her with her emotional maturity. That sounds like very wise advice. It also made me realize something else, Victoria continued, her voice taking on the thoughtful tone that indicated she was working through complex ideas. I think Mama was so scared of leaving me alone that she tried to give me rules that would keep me safe from every possible hurt. But you can't really live that way, can you? You can't protect yourself from all pain without also protecting yourself from all joy. The profundity of this observation took Sarah's breath away. Victoria had just articulated one of the fundamental truths about human existence, the reality that vulnerability and connection were inextricably linked, that the price of love was always the possibility of loss. No, Sarah agreed softly. You can't. Living fully means accepting that sometimes you'll be hurt, but believing that the connections and experiences are worth the risk. Victoria was quiet for a moment, then looked up at Sarah with eyes that seemed far too wise for her 9 years. I want to write another letter to Mama. I want to tell her that I understand why she was scared, but that I'm ready to take some risks if it means I can have friends and people who care about me. I think that's a beautiful idea, Sarah said, pulling Victoria closer in a gentle hug. And I think your mother would be proud to know that her daughter is brave enough to choose love over fear. The letter Victoria wrote that night was shorter than her first one, but it carried even more emotional weight. She wrote about learning to trust her own judgment, about discovering that other women could be allies rather than enemies, and about her growing understanding that honoring her mother's memory didn't require following all of her mother's fears. But the real breakthrough came the next morning at breakfast, when Margaret made an observation that would change everything. You know, Victoria, Margaret said, spreading jam on her toast with characteristic precision, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I want to tell you something about your mother that you might not know. Victoria looked up from her cereal, immediately alert to any new information about Elena. Your mother wasn't always suspicious of other women. When we were growing up, she had close female friendships. She was actually quite social and trusting. But something changed when she got sick. Richard, who had been reading the financial section of the newspaper, suddenly went very still. This was territory that had never been explored, aspects of Elena's illness that had been too painful to examine. What do you mean? Victoria asked, her voice careful but curious. Margaret glanced at Richard, seeking permission to continue. When he nodded slightly, she took a deep breath. When your mother was in the hospital, she had some very difficult experiences with female nurses and doctors. There was one particular incident where a nurse was quite cruel to her, said some terrible things about her prognosis when she thought Elena couldn't hear. There were also some issues with female doctors who seemed to dismiss her concerns or treat her like she was being overly emotional about her symptoms. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Victoria set down her spoon, her young mind processing this new information about her mother's final mindset. So when Mama told me not to trust women, Victoria said slowly, she was thinking about the women who had been mean to her when she was sick and scared. I think that's very likely, Margaret said gently. People who are facing death often have their worldview shaped by their most recent experiences. If the women your mother encountered during her illness were unsympathetic or cruel, it would make sense that she would want to protect you from similar treatment. Richard spoke for the first time since Margaret had begun this explanation, his voice rough with emotion. She never told me about those incidents. I knew she was having difficulties with some of the medical staff, but I didn't realize how deeply it had affected her perspective. Victoria was processing this information with the careful attention she gave to all revelations about her mother. So it wasn't that Mama thought all women were bad, she said thoughtfully. It was that she was hurt by some women when she was vulnerable, and she didn't want me to be hurt the same way. Exactly, Margaret confirmed. Her advice came from love and fear, not from hatred or prejudice. She was trying to protect you from experiencing the kind of cruelty she had experienced. This reframing of Elena's final words was perhaps the most healing gift Victoria could have received. Instead of carrying the burden of believing her mother had been fundamentally wrong or had harbored deep-seated prejudices, she could understand Elena's advice as the frightened counsel of a dying woman who had been wounded by unkind people at her most vulnerable moment. I wish I could tell her that not all women are like the ones who hurt her, Victoria said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. I wish I could tell her about Sarah and you and Mrs. Patterson and all the people who have been kind to me. Maybe you can, Margaret suggested gently. Not in person, obviously, but in your heart. Maybe you can live the kind of life that shows your mother's spirit that women can be trusted, that connections can heal instead of hurt, that her daughter can be both smart and protected without being isolated. This conversation marked the final transformation in Victoria's understanding of her mother's legacy. She could honor Elena's love and concern while also recognizing that some of her advice had been shaped by pain rather than wisdom. She could keep the parts of her mother's final words that served her growth while releasing the parts that had trapped her in isolation. Over the remaining days of Margaret's visit, Victoria blossomed in ways that amazed everyone who witnessed it. She asked questions about Margaret's career, expressed interest in learning more about law and business, and even began talking about her own future ambitions. For the first time since Elena's death, she was looking forward rather than backward, seeing possibilities instead of only restrictions. The night before Margaret's departure, the entire family gathered in the living room for what had become their evening tradition of conversation and connection. Victoria sat between Sarah and her father, with Margaret across from them, and the atmosphere was warm with the kind of intimacy that comes from honest communication and mutual respect. I want to thank you all, Victoria said suddenly, her voice clear and strong. A year ago, I was so angry and scared that I couldn't let anyone close to me. I thought that protecting Mama's memory meant staying angry forever. But you've taught me that the best way to honor her is to live the kind of life she would have wanted for me. A life with friends and love and connections. Richard reached over to take his daughter's hand, his eyes bright with tears he didn't try to hide. Your mother would be so proud of the person you're becoming, Victoria. So incredibly proud. I know she would, Victoria agreed. And I think she would be happy that I learned to think for myself while still carrying her love with me. Margaret nodded approvingly. That's exactly right, sweetheart. The greatest gift we can give to the people we love is to live authentically and fully, not to limit ourselves out of fear or loyalty to their limitations. Sarah watched this exchange with deep satisfaction and affection. Victoria had not only overcome her destructive patterns of behavior but had developed genuine wisdom about love, loss, and human connection. She had learned to honor her mother's memory while also claiming her own right to grow and change. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was yet to come. On the morning of Margaret's departure, Victoria made an announcement that surprised everyone. I want to start a support group, she said over breakfast. For kids who have lost parents and are having trouble trusting people. I want to help them understand that being angry and scared is normal, but that staying angry and scared forever isn't the only choice. The adults at the table exchanged glances of amazement. This was beyond anything they could have imagined when Sarah first arrived at the Whitmore mansion. Victoria was not only healing from her own trauma but wanting to help others heal from theirs. That's a wonderful idea, Sarah said, her voice filled with admiration. How would you want to structure something like that? Victoria's eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm she hadn't shown since before her mother's death. We could meet once a week, maybe here at the house. I could share my story about how Mama's words kept me isolated, and other kids could share their stories too. We could help each other figure out which parts of what our parents told us still serve us and which parts we need to let go of. Margaret leaned forward with interest. You know, Victoria, there are organizations that would probably love to support something like that. I could help you research funding and structure. Richard felt his heart swell with pride and amazement. His daughter was not only recovering from her trauma but transforming it into a source of healing for others. Elena's death, which had seemed like such a senseless tragedy, was being redeemed through Victoria's growth and her desire to help other children avoid the isolation she had experienced. I think it's a brilliant idea, Richard said. And I think it's exactly the kind of thing your mother would have supported. She always believed in helping people, especially children. Over the following months, Victoria's support group became a reality. The Whitmore mansion, which had once echoed with screams and sorrow, became a sanctuary for children struggling with loss and trust issues. Victoria proved to be a natural facilitator, able to connect with other young people in ways that adults often couldn't. She shared her story honestly, including the mistakes she had made and the lessons she had learned, and her vulnerability gave other children permission to examine their own patterns and beliefs. Sarah continued to work with the family, but her role evolved from crisis intervention to ongoing support and guidance. She helped Victoria develop her leadership skills and provided professional oversight for the support group activities. The relationship between them had grown into something that transcended the traditional caregiver-child dynamic. They had become genuine partners in the work of healing and growth. Richard watched his daughter's transformation with daily amazement. The angry, isolated child who had screamed at every woman who tried to help her had become a confident, compassionate young person who was dedicated to helping others heal from similar wounds. Victoria's intelligence and sensitivity, the very qualities that Elena had feared would make her vulnerable to others' cruelty, had become sources of strength and connection. On the first anniversary of Elena's death, Victoria asked if they could visit her mother's grave together as a family. It was the first time she had wanted to go to the cemetery since the funeral, and both Richard and Sarah recognized it as a significant milestone in her healing journey. They went on a beautiful spring morning, when the Connecticut countryside was alive with new growth and possibility. Victoria carried a letter she had written to her mother, along with a small bouquet of flowers from Elena's beloved garden, which had finally begun to thrive again under Mrs. Patterson's careful tending. At Elena's graveside, Victoria read her letter aloud. It was a masterpiece of love and forgiveness, acknowledging her mother's fears and mistakes while also celebrating the love that had motivated even the most misguided advice. She thanked Elena for teaching her to be strong and independent, apologized for the months of anger and isolation, and promised to live the kind of open, connected life that would honor her mother's memory in the most meaningful way possible. I understand now that you were scared when you told me not to trust other women, Victoria read, her voice steady and clear. You had been hurt by some women when you were sick, and you didn't want me to be hurt the same way. But I've learned that some people hurt us and some people heal us, and gender isn't what makes the difference. Character is what matters. I promise to use the intelligence and sensitivity you gave me to build connections instead of walls, to help people instead of hiding from them. I love you, Mama, and I always will. But I'm ready to live my own life now, the life you would want me to live if you could see how much good I can do in the world. As Victoria placed the flowers on Elena's grave and stepped back into Sarah's embrace, Richard felt a profound sense of completion. The journey that had begun with his daughter's explosive rage and ended with her compassionate wisdom had transformed not just Victoria but their entire family. They had learned that love sometimes comes disguised as protection, that healing requires the courage to question even the most sacred beliefs, and that the greatest honor we can give to those we've lost is to live fully in their absence. The Whitmore mansion was no longer a monument to grief and isolation. It had become a center for healing and connection, a place where children learned that their pain could be transformed into purpose, that their struggles could become sources of strength. And at the heart of it all was Victoria, the little girl who had once screamed at every woman who tried to help her, now dedicated to helping others find their own paths from darkness into light. Years later, when Victoria was grown and leading a national foundation for children dealing with parental loss, she would often think back to that moment when she first placed her small hand in Sarah's, choosing trust over isolation, hope over fear. It had been the turning point not just in her own life but in her understanding of what love really meant. Love wasn't about following rules or avoiding pain. Love was about having the courage to remain open to connection even after being wounded, about choosing growth over safety, about transforming our deepest hurts into our greatest gifts. Elena's secret words had indeed shaped Victoria's life, but not in the way the dying woman had intended. Instead of keeping her daughter isolated and suspicious, they had ultimately taught her the importance of questioning inherited beliefs, of thinking independently while still honoring the love behind even misguided advice. They had shown her that the greatest respect we can give to those we love is to live authentically and fully, even when that means outgrowing some of the limitations they tried to place on us. The screaming had stopped. The healing had begun. And in the end, love had triumphed over fear, connection over isolation, wisdom over the painful legacy of unexamined words spoken in desperation and terror. The billionaire's daughter had found her voice not in rage but in compassion, not in rejection but in the brave choice to keep her heart open to the possibility that the world could be better than her mother's fears had painted it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.